Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Beale Ciphers, a mystery wrapped in iron and ink that has haunted the rolling hills of Virginia for over 2 centuries. Our story begins in the month of January, in the year 1820. The air in Lynchburg was a sharp, biting cold that winter, the kind of chill that sinks deep into the marrow and settles there. Imagine the town as it was then. A rugged, bustling tobacco hub perched on the steep bluffs overlooking the James River. The streets were not the paved corridors we know today, but rather paths of frozen mud and jagged stone, where the rhythmic clack of horse hooves echoed against the timber-framed buildings. Above, the sky was often a heavy, bruised purple, hanging low over the Blue Ridge Mountains that loomed in the distance like silent sentinels. In the heart of this landscape stood the Washington Hotel, a place of warmth and temporary respite. The windows of the inn glowed with the soft, flickering orange of tallow candles and hearth fires, casting long, dancing shadows across the snow-dusted porch. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of seasoned oak logs burning in the fireplace, mixed with the faint, earthy aroma of dried tobacco leaves and the hearty steam of a simmering stew. It was here, amidst the quiet creak of floorboards and the low murmur of weary travelers, that a stranger arrived who would leave behind a legacy of gold and silence. Robert Morris was the keeper of the Washington Hotel, a man known throughout the county for his sternest integrity and unblemished honor. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose word was as solid as the limestone foundations of his inn. Morris moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his hands roughened by years of honest labor and the constant tending of his guests. On that particular evening in 1820, the door to the hotel swung open with a heavy, metallic groan from its iron hinges, admitting a swirl of icy mist and a tall, striking figure. This was Thomas J. Beale. He did not look like the typical merchant or farmer who frequented the establishment. Standing approximately 6 feet in height, Beale possessed a symmetrical form that suggested unusual strength and a life lived in the open air. His most distinguishing feature was his complexion, a dark, swarthy tan that seemed out of place in the pale Virginia winter. It was the skin of a man who had been thoroughly seasoned by the sun and the harsh weather of the western plains. His eyes were as black as jet, sharp and observant, yet they held a genial warmth that immediately put Morris at ease. His hair, equally dark, was worn slightly longer than the fashion of the day, curling just over the collar of his heavy wool coat. To the ladies of Lynchburg, he was a model of manly beauty. To the men, he was a figure of quiet envy and mystery. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a gentleman, yet there was a restlessness in his gaze, a hint of vast horizons and untold secrets that he kept locked behind a polite smile. Beale did not travel alone. He was the leader of a small party, men who shared his weathered appearance and his disciplined, almost military-like bearing. They were a group of adventurers who spoke of the distant West, of territories far beyond the familiar borders of Virginia. During that first winter, Beale became a favored guest at the Washington Hotel. He and Morris spent many long evenings seated in the high-backed wooden chairs near the hearth, the firelight reflecting in their eyes as they shared stories of the changing world. Beale was a man of fine education and sophisticated manners, capable of discussing politics and philosophy with the same ease as he discussed the tracking of buffalo. Yet, for all his openness, he never truly spoke of his business. He hinted at a grand excursion, a journey into the Spanish dominions north of Santa Fe, but the specifics remained as hazy as the wood smoke curling up the chimney. Morris found himself deeply impressed by Beale's character. There was a magnetic quality to the stranger, a sense of deep-seated purpose that commanded respect without the need for loud words. As the winter thawed into the spring of 1820, Beale and his companions prepared to depart. The horses were readied, their breath huffing in the cool morning air, and the leather saddles creaked under the weight of their supplies. Beale shook Morris's hand with a firm, sincere grip, promising to return when his work was done. He rode out of Lynchburg, disappearing into the greening forests of the Blue Ridge, leaving the hotel a little quieter and Robert Morris with a lingering curiosity about the man who had occupied his best room. 2 years passed, 800 days of seasons turning and life continuing in the valley. Then, in the month of January 1822, the stranger returned. When Thomas J. Beale stepped back through the doors of the Washington Hotel, he seemed transformed. If it were possible, he was darker and swarthier than before, his face etched with the fine lines of a man who had stared into the relentless sun for too long. His clothes were worn, stained with the dust of 1,000 miles, and his hands were calloused and hard. Yet his genial spirit remained. He greeted Morris like an old friend, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to carry the resonance of the Great Plains. He stayed through that winter, once again becoming a fixture by the fireplace. However, the atmosphere was different this time. There was a weight to Beale's presence, a gravity that hadn't been there 2 years prior. He spent hours in his room, the soft scratch of a quill pen audible through the door, and the faint scent of melting, sealing wax drifting into the hallway. He seemed to be a man settling his affairs, a man preparing for a journey from which he might not return. Morris observed him with a quiet concern, sensing that the adventures Beale had found in the West were far more significant, and perhaps more dangerous, than he had ever let on. The bond between the innkeeper and the traveler deepened into a profound trust, a silent agreement between two men of honor. The moment of truth arrived in the spring of 1822. The morning was damp and gray, with a fine mist clinging to the rooftops of Lynchburg. Beale stood in the parlor of the hotel, a heavy, locked iron box resting on the table between him and Robert Morris. The box was unremarkable in its appearance, a dark, sturdy chest of wrought iron, cold to the touch and smelling of old metal and oil. But when Beale spoke, his voice held a solemnity that made the very air seem to still. He told Morris that the box contained papers of immense value and importance, not just to himself, but to his companions who waited for him in the wilderness. He asked Morris to take charge of this box, to guard it with the same integrity he brought to all his dealings. The instructions were specific and haunting. Morris was to keep the box sealed for a period of 10 years. If, after those 10 years had passed, neither Beale nor any of his party had returned to claim it, Morris was authorized to break the lock. Beale explained that he would send a key, a cipher key, from St. Louis in the summer of 1832, which would make the contents of the box intelligible. Without that key, Beale warned, the papers would be nothing more than a riddle. He placed his hand on the iron lid, his dark eyes meeting Morris's with a look of absolute reliance. With a final farewell, Beale walked out into the mist, mounted his horse, and rode away from the Washington Hotel for the last time. Robert Morris watched him until he was a mere shadow against the trees, and then he turned back to the iron box, its weight a new and silent inhabitant of his home, holding secrets that would remain dormant for decades to come. The seasons in Lynchburg began to bleed into one another, a slow procession of humid summers and biting, frost-nipped winters that layered the town in a quiet, repetitive rhythm. Robert Morris watched from the windows of the Washington Hotel as the mud of the streets dried into dust and turned back to slush, time and again. The iron box, heavy and cold, remained exactly where he had placed it for safekeeping, tucked away from the prying eyes of travelers and the casual curiosity of the kitchen staff. It was a physical weight in his life, a silent passenger in the corner of a darkened room, its rough metal surface gradually gathering a fine, velvet-like coat of gray dust. Morris would sometimes run his fingers over the lid, feeling the bite of the iron and the stubborn resistance of the lock, remembering the swarthy man with the piercing eyes who had handed it to him with such gravity. Thomas Beale had spoken of adventure and shared fortunes, but as the months stretched into years, Those words began to feel like the echoes of a half-remembered dream. The hotel hummed with the lives of strangers, the clink of silverware, and the low murmur of political debates, but the box held a silence that was absolute, a void in the middle of a busy life that seemed to grow heavier with every passing month of the 1820s. By the time 1832 arrived, the 10-year mark set by Beale had finally dawned. Morris found himself standing more frequently by the front door, his eyes scanning the horizon for the post rider, his ears tuned to the rhythmic thumping of horse hooves on the packed earth of the road. June arrived with a sweltering heat that shimmered over the Virginia hills, and with it, the specific promise Beale had made, that a key to the ciphers would be mailed from St. Louis. Every morning, the mail arrived in a flurry of leather bags and shouted greetings, and every morning, Morris sorted through the envelopes with trembling hands, looking for a hand he recognized or a postmark from the West. He imagined the letter often. He could almost see the thick parchment, the wax seal, and the neat rows of instructions that would finally unlock the mystery sitting in his parlor. But the days of June trickled away like water through parched soil. July came and went, followed by the turning leaves of autumn, and still, the mail brought nothing but bills, newspapers, and the mundane correspondence of a growing town. The silence from St. Louis was deafening, a void where a resolution should have been, leaving Morris to wonder if the man he had befriended was dead, or if the promise of a key had been nothing more than a phantom hope. The years that followed the missed deadline of 1832 were marked by a different kind of waiting. It was no longer the sharp, urgent anticipation of a man expecting a guest, but the dull, heavy resignation of a guardian of a ghost. The decade turned, and the 1830s gave way to the 1840s, and still, the box remained. Morris himself was changing. His hair had silvered, and his steps were slower on the floorboards of the hotel. He began to feel as though he were the only person left in the world who remembered the name Thomas Beale. The world outside Lynchburg was moving faster, with steam engines and shifting borders, but inside the hotel, the iron box was an anchor to a forgotten spring morning in 1822. He often looked at the box and felt a sense of profound duty, a loyalty that transcended the simple logic of time. He had promised to wait, and so he waited, even as the possibility of Beale's return faded into the impossible. The box became a symbol of a secret he couldn't share, a mystery that occupied the quiet corners of his mind during long, lonely evenings when the fire in the hearth burned low, and the shadows stretched long across the rug. He was a man holding a lock for which there was no key, a sentinel for a treasure that might not even exist, yet he could not bring himself to break the seal while any spark of hope remained. Finally, in the year 1843, the weight of the 23-year silence became too much to bear. It was a day characterized by a peculiar stillness, the air thick and expectant, as Morris finally decided that his long watch was over. He brought the box out into the light of a workspace, the iron catching the afternoon sun for the first time in decades. His hands, now aged and spotted, gripped the handle of a heavy hammer and a cold steel chisel. The room was silent, save for the sound of his own heavy breathing and the distant chirp of a bird outside. With a sharp, metallic clang that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the building, he struck the lock. The first blow did little more than scar the metal, but he struck again and again, the violence of the act feeling like a betrayal of his old friend, yet necessary for his own peace of mind. On the fourth strike, the internal mechanism groaned and shattered. The lid, which had been sealed tight since the era of his youth, yielded with a dry, rusted shriek. As it swung open, a scent drifted out into the room, the smell of trapped air from 20 years prior, a mix of old iron, stale paper, and the faint, ghostly tang of cedar. Morris paused, his heart thumping against his ribs, staring down into the dark interior of the chest. Inside, nestled against the dark metal floor, lay a small bundle of papers. They were wrapped in a protective layer that had kept them remarkably preserved, though the edges were yellowed to the color of old bone. With fingers that shook with a mixture of dread and excitement, Morris lifted the documents. There were 3 separate sheets of paper, each one covered from top to bottom in dense, meticulously penned columns of numbers. Thousands of digits stared back at him, grouped in strange, erratic patterns that meant absolutely nothing to the naked eye. They were the 3 coded papers, the ciphers that held the secrets of the mountain horde. Along with them, he found a long, explanatory letter addressed to himself. As he unfolded the parchment, the ink appeared dark and clear, the handwriting of Thomas Beale as sharp as it had been the day it was written. The letter detailed the incredible journey of 30 men into the heart of the western wilderness, their discovery of a vast gold mine, and the subsequent burial of the riches in the soil of Bedford County. It spoke of a treasure so immense it could change the fate of thousands, and it named Morris as the one man trusted to ensure its safe return to the families of the men who had found it. The weight of the secret had finally shifted from the box to the man, and as Morris read the words, the true burden of the Beale ciphers began to take hold of his soul. The transfer of the mystery happened in the year 1862. The air in Lynchburg was heavy with the weight of a nation divided by war, but inside the quiet parlor of Robert Morris, a different kind of burden was being shifted from one soul to another. Morris was 84 years old now, his hands gnarled like the roots of an ancient oak, his eyes clouded by the fog of nearly 9 decades. He sat in his favorite high-backed chair, the velvet upholstery worn thin by years of contemplation and the restless shifting of a man with a secret. Across from him sat a trusted friend, a man whose name has been lost to the swirling mists of history, remembered only as the anonymous author of the papers that would eventually change everything. The iron box sat between them on a low table, its surface scratched and dull, no longer the gleaming mystery it had been 40 years prior. Morris reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the cold metal. He told his friend of Thomas Beale, of the man with the jet-black eyes who had vanished into the western horizon, and of the promise that had never been kept. The key had never come. The letters remained locked in their numeric shells. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights, Morris pushed the box toward his companion. He asked for one thing, that the friend would not let the secret die with him. He passed the torch, not of wealth, but of an obsession that had haunted the innkeeper's final years. The friend took the box home, and for a long time it sat in the corner of his study, a silent sentinel gathering a thin layer of gray dust. But the mind is a restless thing, and eventually the pull of the cipher became irresistible. He began his work by the amber glow of a kerosene lamp, the flame dancing and casting long, flickering shadows against walls lined with leather-bound books. He would sit for hours, the 3 sheets of paper spread out before him like a map of an unknown world. The second sheet was the one that drew him in first. It was a dense forest of numbers, hundreds of them, separated by commas and periods, written in a hand that was steady and deliberate. He began to experiment, his mind racing through the possibilities of how a man like Beale would hide his words. He knew that this was likely a book cipher, a method where each number corresponds to a specific word in a text. But which book? He started with the most common volumes found in a Virginia gentleman's library. He spent months with the Holy Bible, counting words in Genesis, in the Psalms, in the Revelations, only to find that the numbers translated into a chaotic jumble of consonants that made no sense to the human ear. He turned to the works of Shakespeare, his fingers tracing the lines of Hamlet and Macbeth until they were stained gray with ink and age. Still, the code remained a wall of stone, unyielding and cold. The breakthrough did not come in a flash of lightning, but in a moment of quiet, desperate clarity. It was the year 1863. The friend had been staring at the second sheet for so long that the numbers had begun to blur into a single, undulating wave of ink. His gaze drifted to a copy of the United States Declaration of Independence resting on a shelf nearby. It was a document of liberty, a foundational pillar of the world Beale had lived in. He wondered if perhaps the key was not hidden in a work of fiction or faith, but in the very fabric of the country itself. He pulled the document down, the parchment crinkling with a sound like dry leaves in a winter wind. He began the tedious process of numbering every single word. He wrote a small 1 over the word when, a 2 over in, a 3 over the, and a 4 over course. His pen moved slowly, the rhythmic scratching the only sound in the room besides the soft, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. He reached the 71st word, which was instituted. He looked at the first number on the second sheet of the cipher. It was 71. He took the first letter of instituted, the letter I, and wrote it down on a fresh piece of paper with a hand that had suddenly gone cold. His heart began to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. The next number was 194. He counted forward through the declaration, his finger trailing under the words describing the laws of nature and of nature's God. He reached the 194th word and took the first letter. An H, the third number, was 38, leading him to the letter A. The fourth number was 1701. He moved deep into the text, his eyes aching from the strain of the low light. The letters began to form a sentence, emerging from the darkness like a ghost taking shape. I, H, A, V, E, D, E, P, O, S, I, T, E, D, I have deposited. The friend stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The wall had crumbled. The stone had been rolled away. He worked through the night, the lamp burning low until the wick began to sputter and smoke, but he did not notice the smell of the dying flame. He was no longer in a quiet study in Virginia. He was standing in his mind within a cold, dark vault in the hills of Bedford County. The words flowed onto his page in a steady, terrifying stream, revealing a hoard of such magnitude that it felt almost impossible to believe. The decoded message spoke of an excavation, a vault hidden 6 feet beneath the surface of the earth. It was located about 4 miles from Buford's, a well-known tavern and stagecoach stop in the shadow of the Peaks of Otter. The description of the contents was meticulous and staggering. The first deposit, according to the paper, had been made in November of 1819. It consisted of 1,014 pounds of gold and 3,812 pounds of silver. The sheer weight of it was incomprehensible. Thousands of pounds of precious metal hauled across the wilderness and buried in the silence of the forest. But there was more. A second deposit had been added in December of 1821. This second cache contained 1,907 pounds of gold and 1,288 pounds of silver. Beside the bullion lay a collection of jewels, obtained in St. Louis in exchange for silver to make the final leg of the journey easier and to save on transportation. These jewels alone were valued at $13,000 at the time, a king's ransom in the early 19th century. The message explained that the treasure was packed securely into iron pots, protected by iron covers, resting on a floor of solid stone and lined with more stone to keep the heavy Virginia clay from reclaiming it. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and pale oranges, the friend sat back, exhausted and trembling. He held in his hands the inventory of a fortune that surpassed his wildest dreams. But the victory was incomplete. He turned his eyes to the first and third papers, the sheets that would tell him exactly where the vault was located and who the rightful heirs were. He applied the same key, the same Declaration of Independence, to the first sheet. He counted the words, he took the letters, and he found only a garbled mess of characters that stared back at him like a mocking face. He tried the third sheet, hoping for the names of the 30 men who had discovered the gold. But again, the key of liberty failed to turn the lock. The Declaration of Independence was the key only for the second paper. The other two remained as silent and impenetrable as the day they were written. He had the list of the treasure, the what and the how much, but the where and the who remained buried in a code he could not break. The obsession that had consumed Robert Morris now took firm hold of his friend, a puzzle that offered a glimpse of a golden sun, but left the world in total darkness. The weight of the secret had become too heavy for one man to carry alone, and so, in the year 1885, the silence was finally broken. In a small, dusty print shop in Lynchburg, Virginia, the rhythmic thumping of a heavy iron press filled the air, a sound like a heartbeat echoing through the narrow streets. James B. Ward, a man whose name would forever be linked to this mystery, watched as the ink met the page, birthing a modest pamphlet titled The Beale Papers. The paper was thin and slightly yellowed even then, smelling of linseed oil and damp timber. It cost only 50 cents, a humble price for a document that promised to reveal a fortune worth millions. As the stacks of pamphlets grew higher, the smell of fresh ink mingled with the humid Virginia air, carrying with it a scent of obsession that was about to ignite the public's imagination. Each copy held 23 pages of hope and madness, bound together by the belief that a king's ransom lay buried in the dark soil of the nearby hills. The local townspeople, unaware of the storm that was brewing, walked past the shop windows. While inside the first few copies were being handed out, their pages still warm from the press, their secrets finally vulnerable to the light of day. Within those pages lay the extraordinary revelation that changed everything. The anonymous author of the pamphlet, a friend of the innkeeper Robert Morris, had spent 20 long years staring at the strings of numbers until his eyes grew dim and his mind grew weary. But he had achieved one singular, miraculous victory. He had discovered that the second cipher was built upon the words of the United States Declaration of Independence. By numbering each word of that sacred document, he found that the code began to melt away, replaced by a clear, haunting voice from the past. The decoded message was a staggering inventory of wealth. It spoke of a vault, roughly lined with stone, hidden 6 feet beneath the surface of the earth. Inside, it described 1,014 pounds of gold and 3,812 pounds of silver, deposited in November of 1819. A second deposit, made in December of 1821, added 1,907 pounds of gold and 1,288 pounds of silver. There were jewels, too, obtained in St. Louis and valued at $13,000, all packed into heavy iron pots with iron covers. The words were so precise, so grounded in the language of weight and measure, that they felt tangible, as if one could reach through the paper and touch the cold, tarnished surface of the metal. The pamphlet pointed a finger directly at Bedford County, specifically mentioning a location about 4 miles from Buford's Tavern. This tavern, once a bustling stop for weary travelers and stagecoaches, stood as a silent witness to the growing frenzy. The landscape of Bedford was one of rolling hills, deep, tangled forests, and the looming, misty peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. As the contents of the pamphlet spread, the quiet of the countryside was shattered. The sound of metal meeting earth became a new, frantic melody in the woods. Men came with lanterns and picks, their shadows stretching long and thin against the trunks of ancient oaks. They looked for the telltale signs of a vault, a flat stone, a depression in the ground, or a marker left by Thomas Beale decades before. The air in the valley grew heavy with the smell of turned soil. Every shovelful of dirt held the promise of a golden glimmer, and every night, the flickering lights of treasure hunters could be seen moving like ghosts through the underbrush. They were searching for a needle in a haystack of mountain laurel and granite, driven by the haunting certainty that they were standing directly above a fortune that could change their lives forever. Yet, despite the clarity of the second message, the first and third ciphers remained like iron doors without keys. The first cipher, the most tantalizing of all, was said to describe the exact locality of the vault. Without it, the treasure hunter was blind, left to wander the vast acreage of Bedford County on nothing but a hunch. The third cipher held the names of the 30 men who had accompanied Beale, the rightful owners of the gold, whose families were still waiting for word of their loved ones. These 2 codes were shorter, more compact, and utterly impenetrable. Cryptographers and mathematicians from across the country turned their focus to these blocks of numbers, their desks covered in scraps of paper and discarded theories. They tried every book they could find, the Bible, the works of Shakespeare, even local tax records, hoping to find the sequence that would unlock the location. The silence of the first cipher was deafening. It was a wall of numbers that refused to speak, a puzzle that seemed to mock the very men who sought to solve it. As the weeks turned into months, the initial excitement began to curdle into a quiet, desperate frustration. The gold was there, described in vivid detail, yet it was protected by a barrier of logic that no human mind seemed able to breach. The frenzy of 1885 left deep scars on the community and the land itself. Fields were left unplowed as farmers became obsessed with the codes, their hands becoming calloused not from the plow, but from the shovel. Families were strained, and fortunes were wasted on failed expeditions and expensive equipment. The pamphlet had democratized the hunt, making every man a potential millionaire, but it also sowed a seed of eternal restlessness. In the local general stores, the talk was no longer of crops or weather, but of prime numbers and substitution ciphers. The mystery had become a fever, a sickness of the spirit that took hold in the dim light of the evening and refused to let go. Even as the sun dipped behind the Blue Ridge, casting the valley into a deep, cool violet, the obsession persisted. The hills of Bedford County held their breath, keeping the secret of the vault tightly wrapped in roots and stone. The first and third ciphers remained as they are today, unbroken, unyielding, and forever whispering of a treasure that lies just out of reach, beneath 6 feet of Virginia earth, waiting for a key that may never be found. Lure of the hidden gold, leaving the red Virginia clay to be turned by the spade rather than the plow. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the landscape of Bedford County began to tell a story of collective mania. The earth here is a specific shade of ochre, a heavy and damp substance that clings to the skin and stains the hem of a man's trousers. In the quiet valleys near Montvale, this earth was no longer treated as a source of life, but as a vault that needed to be breached. Seeking a fortune that felt just inches away, hundreds of men descended upon the woods with a single-minded intensity. They worked in the silver light of the moon, their breath misting in the cold mountain air, as they dug thousands of holes that pockmarked the hillsides like a pox. This era of the hunt gave the region a haunting and unofficial name that is still whispered by local historians: the Valley of Broken Shovels. It was named not only for the literal tools of oxidized iron and splintered ash wood that were left to rot in the undergrowth, but for the broken spirits of those who wielded them. You can still imagine the sound of those years if you listen closely to the wind in the trees, the rhythmic, wet thud of metal striking clay, and the sharp, metallic ring of a spade hitting a stone that, for one heart-stopping moment, someone hoped was the lid of an iron pot. The quiet desperation of the hand shovel eventually evolved into something far louder and more violent. By the time the 1960s arrived, the treasure hunters had grown tired of the slow progress of the pickaxe. They brought with them the roar of industry and the smell of sulfur. Brothers like Clayton and George Hart, driven by the elusive promises of a psychic medium, decided that the mountain would only surrender if it was forced. They bypassed the traditional labor of digging and turned instead to high explosives. Imagine the stillness of a Virginia morning, shattered by the sudden, bone-deep thrum of a dynamite blast. The shockwave would roll through the valley, vibrating in the chests of everyone for miles, as a geyser of dirt, ancient roots, and shattered granite erupted into the sky. When the smoke cleared, smelling of bitter chemicals and scorched earth, the trees that had stood for a century were gone, replaced by jagged craters. One particular explosion famously obliterated a massive, ancient oak tree that the medium had pointed to with a trembling finger. When the dust finally settled and the rain began to fill the new hole, there was no glint of gold, only the white, splintered remains of the wood and the deep, dark silence of the mountain that seemed to swallow the sound of their frustration. In the 1970s, the hunt transformed again, becoming a financial abyss for those who could not let the mystery go. Stan Cizanowski became a living testament to the destructive power of the Beale Ciphers. He did not just dig. He waged a full-scale mechanical war against the Bedford soil. Over a period of 7 years, he poured more than $70,000 into the effort, a massive sum that represented a lifetime of savings and security. He brought in heavy bulldozers, their yellow paint peeling under the hot Virginia sun, and their massive treads caked in thick, drying mud. The constant, low-frequency growl of the engines became a permanent fixture of the landscape, drowning out the natural sounds of the Blue Ridge. Cizanowski tore through the brush, leveled small hills, and redirected the flow of natural springs, all in pursuit of a vault that remained forever out of reach. The local community watched with a growing sense of resentment. Farmers found their property lines blurred, and their fences cut by midnight trespassers who followed Cizanowski's lead. Cattle would stumble into deep, abandoned trenches in the dark, breaking their legs and leaving the landowners to deal with the tragic consequences of a stranger's obsession. The treasure had become a ghost that haunted the living, leaving physical scars on the land that would take generations to heal. Perhaps the most chilling chapter of this period occurred in 1983, when the fever of the hunt crossed a sacred line. A woman named Marilyn Parsons, driven by a conviction that the Ciphers hid a location within a local church graveyard, arrived with a rented backhoe. The air that morning was likely crisp, carrying the scent of mown grass and the distant smell of wood smoke. The mechanical arm of the backhoe was a harsh, jarring sight against the weathered headstones of the cemetery. As she operated the machine, the metal teeth of the bucket tore deep into the earth, but instead of the hollow sound of an iron chest, she heard the sickening crunch of wood and stone. She had unearthed a coffin handle and the silent, ancient remains of the deceased. The desecration was a shock to the county, a moment where the greed of the treasure hunter finally collided with the ultimate finality of the grave. She was arrested and spent 2 months in the local jail, eventually being ordered to leave Virginia and never return. This event served as a somber reminder that the Beale treasure was not just a puzzle of numbers, but a force that could strip a person of their morality and their respect for the very foundations of the community. As the physical world became too dangerous or too expensive to excavate, the hunt migrated into the cold, silent realm of the digital age. In the late 1960s, the Beale Cipher Association was formed, bringing together a new breed of seeker who preferred the hum of the computer to the weight of the spade. Scientists and elite codebreakers, some of whom had spent their lives working for the highest levels of government intelligence, turned their attention to the 3 sheets of numbers. In windowless rooms lit by the flickering green glow of monochromatic monitors, they fed the ciphers into massive mainframe computers like the Sperry Univac. The smell of these rooms was different, not the smell of damp earth and sweat, but the sterile scent of ozone and heated circuits. The soft, rhythmic clicking of the keyboards and the steady whir of cooling fans became the soundtrack of a new kind of obsession. These men, like Carl Hammer and Richard Greaves, spent thousands of hours analyzing frequency patterns and testing the ciphers against every major text in the English language. They were searching for a logic that would unlock the vault, yet the machines proved just as fallible as the men with the dynamite. The computers could crunch billions of possibilities, but they could not account for the human element of the mystery. By the end of the century, the digital landscape was just as cluttered with failures as the hills of Bedford. The valley of broken shovels had simply expanded into a valley of broken algorithms, leaving the treasure of Thomas Beale exactly where it had been for nearly 200 years, safely hidden within the silence of the earth and the complexity of the code. The hum of the modern computer eventually fades, leaving only the sound of a winter wind rattling against the windowpane of a quiet study. Here, in the soft, amber glow of a desk lamp, the digital hunt ends and a different kind of investigation begins. We move away from the frantic digging and the complex algorithms, settling instead into the cool, analytical world of the skeptic. For over a century, the Beale Ciphers have acted like a siren's song, drawing thousands into the woods of Bedford County with shovels and dreams of gold. But as the years turn into decades, and the decades into centuries, a chilling question has begun to take root in the minds of historians and cryptographers alike. What if the treasure is not buried in the earth, but is instead a phantom born of ink and paper? What if the greatest mystery of the American West is nothing more than a masterfully crafted ghost story? In the 1980s, a researcher named Joe Nickel sat amidst the dust of historical archives, his fingers tracing the edges of the 1885 pamphlet that started it all. He wasn't looking for gold. He was looking for a crack in the narrative, a loose thread that could unravel the entire tapestry of Thomas Beale's legacy. Nickel noticed something peculiar as he read the letters attributed to Thomas Beale, supposedly written in 1822. The language felt wrong. It was too polished, too consistent with the writing style of the late 19th century. One word in particular stood out like a jarring note in a soft melody: stampeding. In the letter from the Iron Box, Beale describes his party's adventures out west, using the word to describe the wild movement of buffalo. However, linguistic history is a stubborn witness. Research into the evolution of American English suggests that the word stampeding did not enter common print or widespread usage until the 1840s, specifically around 1844. If Beale had written that letter in 1822, he would have been using a term that had not yet been birthed into the American lexicon. This single anachronism acts like a cold splash of water, suggesting that the letter was not written by a rugged adventurer in a St. Louis hotel, but by someone much later, sitting perhaps in a quiet office in Virginia, weaving a tale to capture the public's imagination. The skepticism deepens when we turn our gaze to the numbers themselves. Modern cryptanalysis has moved beyond the simple search for a key, applying the cold, hard logic of mathematics to the ciphers. When scientists applied what is known as Benford's law, a statistical observation about the frequency of leading digits in numerical data, they found a disturbing discrepancy. The second cipher, the one we have successfully decoded using the Declaration of Independence, follows the natural patterns of a genuine code. It feels real. It has the weight and rhythm of a functional message. But the first and third ciphers, the ones that supposedly hide the location of the vault and the names of the 30 adventurers, do not follow these same patterns. To a mathematician, these strings of digits look less like a hidden language and more like a deliberate, human-made imitation of randomness. It is as if someone carefully selected numbers to look like a code without ever intending for them to be broken. They are beautiful, intricate, and utterly hollow, a mathematical mirage that keeps the seeker walking forever toward a horizon that never grows closer. If the ciphers are a hoax, we must ask who would benefit from such a grand deception. The shadow falls heavily on James Ward, the man who published the original pamphlet and sold it for 50 cents a copy in 1885. At the time, Virginia was struggling through the economic hardships of the post-Civil War era. A gripping story of lost Confederate-era wealth, or rather, a pre-war fortune hidden in Virginia soil, would have been a powerful draw. Some theorists suggest the entire story is a sophisticated Masonic allegory. Ward was a high-ranking Mason, and the narrative of a secret vault, the 3 encrypted messages, and the iron box mirrors many of the symbolic rituals of the fraternity. In this light, the treasure is not physical gold, but a metaphor for spiritual or hidden knowledge. The search itself becomes the ritual, a journey through darkness in pursuit of a light that only the initiated can see. The holes in the ground, scattered across Bedford County, are not just excavations. They are monuments to the human desire to believe in something hidden, something ancient, and something profoundly valuable. Yet, even in the face of this mounting evidence, a small, stubborn flicker of hope remains. In 1832, the year the key was supposed to be delivered, a newspaper in St. Louis published a list of unclaimed mail. On that list, tucked between the names of travelers and merchants, was a letter addressed to a Robert Morris. This tiny, verifiable fact is the thread that believers cling to. Was that the key? Did it sit in a dusty post office, ignored and forgotten, while the man it was meant for lived out his days in Lynchburg, oblivious to the fortune just beyond his reach? It is this balance between the impossible and the improbable that keeps the legend of Thomas Beale alive. We are drawn to the idea that a fortune worth over $60 million is resting just 6 feet below the soil, guarded only by a sequence of numbers that no human mind can crack. It is a story of silence, of a secret kept so well that it may have never existed at all. The mountains of Virginia remain still, their peaks shrouded in the same mist that likely greeted the first hunters who ventured into the woods with a map that could not be read. The night has grown deep now, and the figures of Thomas Beale and Robert Morris have retreated back into the soft shadows of history. Whether the vault exists, or if it is merely a masterpiece of 19th century fiction, it has achieved a different kind of immortality. It lives in the imagination of every person who has ever looked at a puzzle and felt the spark of a possible solution. The gold may be a dream, but the mystery is real. It is a reminder that some things are meant to remain hidden, tucked away in the quiet corners of the past, where they cannot be disturbed by the harsh light of the present. As we leave the Blue Ridge Mountains behind, the whispers of the ciphers fade into the rustle of the leaves. The hunt is over for tonight. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.